My father-in-law looked up from the head of that conference table, made eye contact with me for exactly 2 seconds, and said, "This company has always been an Ashton company, Cole, and it always will be." The room went quiet in a specific way I hadn't heard before, not the quiet of a slow afternoon or a meeting winding down, the quiet of a room where everyone has just understood something at the same time, and nobody wants to be the person who reacts first. There were 11 people at that table, project managers I'd brought on board, estimators I'd personally interviewed and trained, my lead site supervisor, a guy named Dwight who had worked beside me through 3 of the biggest commercial jobs this company had ever landed. The overhead lights in that conference room buzzed at a frequency you only noticed when everything else went silent. Outside the window, the parking lot sat in the gray light of an early November morning in Memphis. Inside, nobody moved. That was the moment, a Tuesday in November. A conference room that smelled like old coffee, and the dry erase markers nobody had put the caps back on. My name is Cole Merritt. I am 47 years old, and for 19 years, I ran Ashton Commercial Electrical out of Memphis, Tennessee. I need to back up to explain how I got to that table. I met my wife at a friend's cookout in Germantown the summer I was 27. She was finishing her master's in education, sharp and patient, in a way that made me feel like I'd been moving too fast through my life up until that point. We got married 14 months later. Her father, Gerald Ashton, ran a small commercial electrical contracting operation, 12 employees, a shop on the east side of town, a fleet of 4 service vans and 2 bucket trucks that had more rust than paint on the rear panels. He offered me a job 6 months after the wedding. My wife didn't push me toward it. She said it was my call. I took it because I saw something in the business that Gerald couldn't quite see from where he was standing, the gap between what the company was doing and what it could be doing with the right systems behind it. I had a background in electrical contracting, journeyman license at 22, foreman at 25, 5 years running a crew for a mid-size commercial outfit in Nashville before I moved to Memphis. I wasn't carrying any impressive credentials, no engineering degree, no MBA, nothing that looks good framed on a wall. What I had was 19 pages of notes from my first 2 weeks at Ashton, every one of them filled with the specific places where money was walking out the door unnoticed. So I got to work. Year 1, I rebuilt the estimating process from the ground up. Gerald had been pricing jobs by gut feel, and a spreadsheet a former employee had built in 2003 that nobody fully understood anymore. I spent 4 months building a new system on my own laptop, my own time, nights and weekends, cross-referencing material costs and labor rates and regional market data until we had a tool that could generate an accurate bid in under 3 hours. We picked up 2 mid-size office renovation contracts that year that we'd have never won before because we couldn't have priced them competitively. Year 2, I overhauled our vendor relationships and dropped our materials costs by 12%. Year 3, we won our first state contract, a 3-building electrical retrofit for a Tennessee Department of Transportation facility outside of Memphis, $87,000. Not large by any measure, but it was the first government contract Ashton had ever held, and it opened a door. By year 7, we had 31 employees and a backlog that ran 16 months out. By year 12, we were doing state contracts regularly, had 2 TDOT facilities contracts and 1 with the Tennessee Department of General Services, and had just been approved for the Federal Contractor Registry. Gerald gave me the title of Vice President of Operations somewhere around year 9. No ownership stake, no equity discussion, a salary of $122,000 that had not moved in 3 years, while the company had grown from a $2 million operation to one doing just under $11 million annually. I told myself the title was enough. I told myself that the work was the point. I told myself that Gerald was old school, that he showed appreciation in other ways, that eventually there would be a real conversation about where I fit in the long-term structure of the company he and I had effectively rebuilt together. Gerald had a nephew. His name was Brandon. Brandon was 33, had finished a business degree at the University of Memphis, and had spent the 4 years since graduation in sales, first medical equipment, then commercial insurance. He was personable, good handshake, remembered your name, the kind of guy who could walk into a room and make everyone feel like he'd known them for years. What he didn't have was a single day of electrical contracting experience. He couldn't read a set of construction drawings. He didn't know the difference between a service entrance and a distribution panel. He'd never written a bid, pulled a permit, managed a subcontractor relationship, or stood on a job site at 6 in the morning trying to figure out why the mechanical schedule had shifted and what that meant for our rough-in timeline. He came into the company talking about client experience strategy and operational scalability. Meanwhile, our estimators were quietly asking me what words he was using and whether they needed to be concerned. Gerald asked me to bring Brandon along, train him, integrate him, give him exposure to the real work. I did exactly that. For 16 months, I walked him through every system I'd built, every client relationship I'd developed, every state agency contact I'd cultivated over nearly 2 decades. I showed him the estimating software, explained the logic behind every formula, walked him through the T-Dot contract management process step by step. He took notes. He nodded. He asked reasonable questions and occasionally said things in client meetings that made me want to look at the ceiling, but I stayed patient. I figured Gerald was building him gradually, that there would be a real conversation at some point about what the future looked like and where I stood in it. The conversation happened, just not the one I'd been expecting. Gerald called a company-wide operations meeting for the second Tuesday of November. I drove in that morning thinking it was the standard end-of-year review backlog, revenue projection, staffing for the coming quarter. I poured a cup of coffee in the break room, said good morning to Dwight, and sat down at the conference table in the same seat I'd occupied at probably 300 meetings over 19 years. Gerald came in, set his notepad down, thanked the team for a strong year. He talked about the backlog, about 2 new projects we'd just been awarded, about the company's position heading into the new year. Then he said he had an announcement about the company's leadership structure going forward. He said that given the growth of the business and the increasing complexity of operations, it was time to bring on dedicated executive leadership. He said he was proud to announce that his nephew Brandon would be joining the company as Executive Vice President of Operations, effective the first of the year. With full operational authority over all project delivery, client relationships, and business development. No phone call the night before. No conversation in his office. No warning of any kind. I looked at Gerald. He looked back at me for a moment, then his eyes went to the window, the same way a person looks away when they know they've done something and have decided they're done explaining it. I asked, as evenly as I could manage, what my role would be in the new structure. He said that my institutional knowledge was invaluable and that we'd work out the details. Then he looked down at his notepad. That was the answer. 11 people in that room. I sat through the remaining 40 minutes of that meeting. Answered a question about the T-Dot renewal timeline when it came to me. Wrote something in the margin of my notepad that I couldn't tell you now. Shook Brandon's hand when Gerald wrapped up and everyone started standing. Walked down the hall to my office and closed the door. On my desk was the binder I'd kept since year 2. Black cover, 3 inches thick, updated quarterly for 19 years. Inside it was everything, every state agency contact I'd developed, with direct lines and notes on how each of them preferred to communicate. Every vendor relationship, with the pricing history and the names of the specific reps I'd worked with long enough to call on short notice. The estimating software documentation, written by me, maintained by me, never uploaded to a company server because when I'd built it there was no company server. The original tool still lived on a personal hard drive at my house, and the version running on company machines was a licensed copy I'd sold to the business for $1 back in year 4, a transaction that had been verbal, witnessed by no one, and documented nowhere. I sat down and just held the binder for a while. Then I set it on my desk and drove home. My wife was already there when I walked in. She'd gotten a text from her aunt, who'd heard from her mother, who'd been told by Gerald that afternoon. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands around a mug of tea, and when I came in, she looked up with the expression of someone who had already made their own decision before I arrived. She said, "Dad did what he always does. He protected his name instead of what was right." I told her I wasn't ready to do anything yet, that I needed a few days to think. She said, "Take whatever time you need, but don't minimize what just happened to you." I took 4 days. Told the office I was working remotely on a project estimate, which was partly true. I sat at my kitchen table with the binder open and went through every page methodically, not out of anger, out of clarity. There's a difference between those two things, and I was just clear enough in those 4 days to know which one I needed to be. On the 3rd day, I found the thing I hadn't been looking for. Our 2 active T-Dot contracts combined value just under $6 million for the current cycle had been executed, with my name listed as the designated project representative in the performance section. Not Gerald's name, not the company's general contact. My name, my direct number, my email address, in the clause that governed who the agency held accountable for project compliance. I'd written it that way years ago because I was the one who knew the project. I'd put my name there as a practical matter, not a strategic one. I hadn't thought about what it meant until I was sitting at my kitchen table reading it for the third time with cold coffee going warm in my hand. I pulled up the actual contract documents on my personal laptop. I kept copies of all active contracts for my own reference, had done so for years. Something I'd started out of habit and never stopped. I read those clauses 4 times. Then, I looked at the Tennessee Department of General Services contract we were midway through. Same structure. My name as the designated representative. 3 contracts, my name in the performance clause on every one. Then I opened the folder on my personal hard drive where the original estimating software files lived. The system I'd built in year 2, on my own time, on my own equipment, before the company had any IT infrastructure worth the name. I checked the employment contract I'd signed when I joined Ashton. It was 4 pages long and had been drafted by a general practice attorney Gerald knew from his church. There was no intellectual property assignment clause. There never had been. Gerald had never thought to ask for one, and his attorney at the time had apparently never thought to suggest it. The system that I'd built and updated for 19 years, the one that had reduced our estimating errors by roughly 30%, the one that had given us a competitive edge on every state bid we'd won since year 2, the one that Brandon had been learning on for 16 months, had never been formally transferred to the company. The company was running a licensed copy. The original intellectual property had never changed hands. I closed the laptop and sat in the kitchen for a long time with the lights off. I want to be honest about what that moment felt like, because it would be easy to make it sound more calculated than it was. I didn't feel like someone who had just found a winning hand. I mostly felt 19 years of something settling into a different shape. I'd given that company everything I had because I believed the work was worth giving. I had never protected myself because it never occurred to me that I would need to. That wasn't ignorance. That was faith. And I was beginning to understand that faith, in a business context, is only as solid as the other person's character. I thought about a man named Tom Callister. Tom owned Callister Electrical Services out of Nashville, one of the 3 or 4 largest commercial electrical contractors in the state. We'd met at a Tennessee Associated Builders and Contractors conference 8 years back, and had stayed in contact since professional courtesy, mutual respect, the occasional phone call when one of us had a question that the other might be able to answer. He'd approached me twice in the past 3 years about coming on board in a senior capacity. The second time, about a year and a half ago, he'd been specific. Cole, I'm building out a state contracts division, and I want someone who already knows how that world works. You're the person I'd want running it. I declined both times, out of loyalty, out of the belief that the people who benefit most from your work will eventually acknowledge it. On the 4th day, I called him. He answered on the 3rd ring and didn't say anything dramatic. Just, I had a feeling I'd hear from you before long. How are you doing, Cole? We met the following week in Nashville at a restaurant he liked near the Gulch, nothing fancy. The kind of place where you could talk without anyone listening. Tom was in his early 50s, had started in the trade as a helper at 17, and knew the business at a level that made conversation easy, in a way I hadn't experienced in a long time. He asked technical questions. He listened to the answers completely before responding. He didn't perform interest, he was just actually interested. The offer was $168,000 base, a senior VP title over the state contracts division, a team of 12, and a formal profit-sharing structure that kicked in at the end of year 1. And then he said something I hadn't heard in a very long time. He said, "Any systems or tools you've developed independently on your own time, your own equipment, we have a process for that. Documented acquisition, fair valuation, you get credited properly. We don't just absorb what people bring, we account for it." I drove back to Memphis that night, thinking about the files on my hard drive. My wife was awake when I got home. We sat in the kitchen past midnight. She asked what he was like. I told her. She asked what I was thinking. I told her that too. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I've thought about a lot since. She said, "My father made you invisible on purpose. Not because he didn't see you. Because seeing you would have cost him something." I told her I was going to call Tom back in the morning. She said, "Good. Do it before you change your mind for the wrong reasons." I called Tom the next morning and told him I was in. We agreed on a start date 5 weeks out, which gave me time to give proper notice and transition cleanly. I went into the office that afternoon and typed my resignation. 2 weeks' notice. Professional, clean, no editorial comment of any kind. I printed it on plain white paper instead of company letterhead. That felt like the right distinction to make. Before I walked it to Gerald's office, I sat down and drafted 3 emails. One to each of my primary contacts at the Tennessee state agencies where we held active contracts, people I'd worked with directly, in some cases for a decade or more. The emails were formal and clear. I informed each of them that I would be transitioning out of my role at Ashton Commercial Electrical, that my last day would be in 2 weeks, and that going forward I would be operating in a senior capacity with Callister Electrical Services in Nashville. I included Tom's contact information and noted that I would be personally overseeing state contract operations in my new role. I didn't say anything negative about Ashton. I didn't explain the circumstances of my departure. I simply notified relevant professional contacts of a change in my status, which I was entirely entitled to do. In 2 of the 3 contracts, I was technically obligated to do exactly that under the terms of the performance clause. I sent all 3 emails. Then I walked to Gerald's office. He was on the phone when I knocked, held up one finger without looking at me, finished his conversation, leaned back in his chair. I set the letter on his desk. He read it. His expression didn't change much, but something behind his eyes did. He asked where I was going. I told him Callister. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that Tom Callister had been trying to poach his people for years. I told him that Tom had approached me twice before, and I declined both times out of loyalty to Ashton. He said loyalty should go both ways. I let that sit in the air for a second. Then I said, "It should, Gerald. You're right about that." He asked if there was anything we could discuss, a revised structure, a new title, an equity arrangement. I told him the conversation we should have had was 3 years ago, and that I appreciated the offer, but my decision was made. He said he hoped this wouldn't make things difficult with the family. I told him that my wife and I had talked it through and we were solid. He started to say something about everything he'd built, everything he'd given me the chance to be part of. I waited until he'd finished. Then I said, "You had a 12-person shop and a fleet with rust on the panels, Gerald. The company you have now, I built that. I'm not saying it to be harsh. I'm saying it because we both know it's true, and at least one of us should say it out loud before I leave." I walked out before he said anything else. The next 2 weeks had the specific texture of endings that haven't been announced yet. People heard through the usual channels. A few of the project managers stopped by my office with the look of people who want to say something but can't quite find the shape of it. Dwight came in on the Wednesday of my second week, sat across from me, and said he was genuinely sorry to see me go. He didn't say much beyond that. We'd worked together long enough that we didn't need to fill the silence. Brandon started following me around with questions. Timeline on the T-Dot renewal. How we handled scope changes on the general services contract. Who to call at which agency when there was a compliance question. I answered everything, completely and honestly. I was leaving clean, and that mattered to me. There were 2 things I didn't hand over. The first was the estimating software. Brandon never asked about it specifically. He'd been using the company's licensed copy for months without fully understanding that what he was using was a separately developed tool with its own origin, its own documentation, and its own ownership history. To him, it was just how the company estimated jobs. He didn't know there was a standalone system behind it, built and maintained outside of Ashton for 19 years. I wasn't going to explain it to him. It wasn't deception. It was simply not volunteering information about something that had never belonged to them. The second thing I didn't hand over was the depth of those agency relationships. On my last Friday, Brandon stopped by my desk around 3 in the afternoon and asked if I'd set up a joint introduction call with the T-Dot contacts before I left so he could get on their radar. I told him I'd send him the contact information. I did names, phone numbers, email addresses, everything that was in the public contract files. What I didn't mention was that those contacts had already heard from me 2 weeks earlier, that they already had Callister's information, that when Brandon dialed those numbers the following Monday and introduced himself as Ashton's new head of operations, he'd be talking to people who already knew I'd moved on and were already thinking about what that meant for their renewal conversations. I wasn't trying to harm Ashton. I was just done carrying things that weren't mine to carry anymore. I cleaned out my desk that Friday afternoon. The binder went into my bag first. A framed photo of my wife and our 2 kids from the previous Christmas, Emma, in a ridiculous Santa hat she'd worn as a joke and never taken off. Our son Jake in the Vanderbilt hoodie he'd lived in since his acceptance letter came. Jake had started his freshman year that August. My father-in-law had mentioned at a family dinner 3 years ago that he'd like to help with tuition when the time came. It had been brought up twice since then and had quietly disappeared both times. The way things disappear when someone realizes the cost is real. We'd figured it out ourselves. It was tighter than it should have been, but we'd managed, and every dollar of it was ours. I picked up the photo, put it in my bag, and took one last look at the office I'd occupied for the better part of 2 decades, desk by the window, a whiteboard I'd filled and erased so many times the surface had gone slightly gray, a shelf of project binders going back to year 3. Through the window, I could see the shopyard. 4 service vans and the 2 bucket trucks, different trucks now, better ones, the kind of equipment we could afford because of what the company had become. I walked out at 4:30 on a Friday afternoon and didn't look back. Monday morning, I was in Nashville. Callister Electrical felt different from the first hour. Nobody called me the son-in-law or the guy Gerald brought in. When I said something in a meeting, people treated it like information and acted on it. Tom checked in once a day with a single question and then left me alone to work. I had a real office with a door that had my name on it. I noticed that more than I expected to. I spent the first 3 weeks the way I always started in a new operation, listening before talking, mapping the actual workflow before suggesting anything. I sat with the estimating team, reviewed the bid history, rode out to 3 active job sites to see how Callister's field operations actually ran versus how they looked on paper. I found 6 process gaps in the first 2 weeks. Not catastrophic, just the kind of accumulated inefficiency that builds up when no one's been looking at the right numbers. In week 4, we began the process of formally integrating my estimating system into Callister's operations. Tom's team had a proper documentation process for exactly this kind of acquisition, software evaluation, IP verification, fair market valuation, everything recorded correctly. The number wasn't significant enough to change my financial situation. That wasn't the point. The point was that for the first time in 19 years, something I had built with my own hands, on my own time, was recognized as mine. Officially, legally, unambiguously. And then it was mine to sell, on my terms, to someone who understood what it was. By the second quarter, Callister's bid accuracy had improved measurably. Our win rate on competitive state submissions went up. On-time performance on active contracts improved enough that Tom included the numbers in our response to the Tennessee Department of Transportation's Midwest Commercial Services contract renewal, a $14.2 million 4-year contract covering facility electrical maintenance across a 23-county region in western Tennessee. The same region Ashton Commercial Electrical had been servicing for the past 6 years. Both companies submitted bids. I knew Ashton's cost structure better than Brandon did at that point. I knew where their margins were thin, where their overhead had grown, what their weaknesses were in the northern service area. I didn't use any of that information improperly. I just built the best proposal I could, based on Callister's actual capabilities, and Callister's actual capabilities, running on better systems with better data, were genuinely stronger than they had been the year before. The contract went to Callister, $14.2 million, 4 years, with an option for 2 additional years if performance benchmarks were met. 2 weeks after the award was announced, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. Area code 901 Memphis. I let it go to voicemail. It was Brandon. The message was 3.5 minutes long. He said the agency contacts weren't responding to him the way he'd expected. Said 2 of the state renewals were in uncertain territory. Said he'd always respected the work I'd done and thought there might be a way to work together going forward. Informally. Just a few conversations. Whatever I thought was fair. He said Gerald didn't know he was calling. I listened to the message twice. Then I called him back. I told him I was glad to help, and that my external consulting rate for state contract strategy was $300 an hour, billed in 2-hour minimums, with a 2-session prepayment required before any calls were scheduled. I told him I could have a simple agreement drawn up within a few days if he wanted to move forward. He said he'd have to look at the budget and get back to me. He never called back. Gerald called 4 times over the next 6 weeks. I let every one of them go to voicemail. The messages followed the same arc consulting structure, bringing expertise back in some capacity, significant compensation being available. The 4th message mentioned the word family 3 times in 90 seconds. I listened to all of them. I didn't return any of them. I thought about calling him back for a while. Thought about what I would say. Then, I decided the only thing worth saying was the thing that was already true without me having to say it. I did call him eventually, one Sunday morning, about 2 months after the TDOT award. He picked up immediately. He started talking before I could say anything, the company's current situation, some restructuring that had been necessary, conversations he'd been having with a regional competitor about a possible partnership, how much had changed since I left, and how much he wished things had gone differently. I waited until he was finished. Then I said, "Gerald, you told me Ashton was an Ashton company. You were right." And I finally remembered which company is mine. I hung up. I found out later through my wife, who had maintained a careful, quiet relationship with her parents through all of it, which I respected entirely, that Ashton Commercial Electrical had entered into a minority partnership with a larger regional contractor to stabilize their cash position after losing the TDOT renewal. Gerald had stepped back from day-to-day operations. Brandon was still with the company in a reduced role. I don't need the details beyond that. I don't spend time thinking about it. What I do think about is this: 19 years. I gave that company 19 years of 6 a.m. start times and Saturday morning estimate revisions and late vendor calls and federal compliance documentation that ran past 9 at night. I gave it everything I knew how to give because I believed the work was worth giving. I was wrong about one thing, and I want to be clear about what that one thing was. I wasn't wrong to work hard. I wasn't wrong to care about what I was building. The work was real, and I'm proud of it. What I was wrong about was the assumption that the people who benefit from your work will eventually match your investment with their own. Sometimes they will. A lot of times, the structure you're working inside simply isn't designed to see you. Not because you haven't proven yourself, because seeing you would require them to give you something, and giving you something would cost them control. If you've spent years building someone else's operation, a family business, a company that had your fingerprints on everything but your name on nothing, a place where your work made everything possible and everyone else took the bows, you already know this feeling. You've felt the slow math of it, the way it adds up year after year until you're sitting in a conference room on a Tuesday morning, wondering how you let it go on this long. Here's what I know now that I didn't let myself know then. Understand what is actually yours, not what you've helped build, not what you've been permitted to contribute to, what is documented, demonstrable, and provably yours, your professional relationships, your independently developed systems, your name in the right clause of the right contract. If you've built something on your own time, on your own equipment, document it from the beginning, date it, keep copies somewhere only you can access, know the difference between what belongs to the company and what belongs to you, and protect yourself with the same care you give to the work. Because in a structure that isn't designed to see you, the only person watching out for your interests is you. When the day comes, and if you've been in this situation, you already sense that it's coming. Don't leave in anger. Anger makes you sloppy. Anger makes you burn things you might need later. Leave prepared. Leave clean. Leave with everything that was yours from the beginning. That's when the math finally works in your favor.
Don't pity me. My heart doesn't need your mercy. I can still stand on my own. I was broken by your leaving, fell deeper than I thought I would. But pain has taught me how to heal now and survive what once I couldn't. You don't have to look back sadly, don't reach out with guilty hands. What you shattered made me stronger. Now I rise where I once collapsed. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow. I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling. I'll learn to breathe again. I once begged for your affection. Now I've learned my worth in scars. And the man you left in pieces found his own way through the dark. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow. I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling. I'll learn to breathe again. heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow, I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling, I'll rise alone again. I'll rise alone again.
They say just forget. Move on like it's easy. But forgetting you feels like remembering someone I've never seen.
I've been trying to erase you from the places in my mind, but the harder that I fight it, the more you're hard to leave behind. Every memory keeps slipping through the cracks I try to close, like a face I should remember, but somehow never know. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true. Every moment turns to fragments, every thought just fades to blue, like I'm searching for a feeling that still only leads to you. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true. If I never met you, maybe I would know just how to heal, but now every empty moment still reminds me what is real. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true.